I would like you to join me with a very warm welcome for VP and DevOps Advocate of Sonatype, Derek Weeks. Thanks, Derek.
This is awesome. I love having a packed house for DevOps Days DC. This is my third DevOps Days DC, so I guess I was here from the beginning. But as you all traveled here today, and you might have come from short or long distances, I'm going to take you a little further. In fact, we're going to go back to Detroit, 1982, a couple of decades ago. Things were moving fast. 4 million vehicles were rolling off the production lines that year in Detroit. Every day, line workers like this were watching 15,000 vehicles roll off the production line every day. Their focus was on velocity. They needed to keep that production line moving. If they had the wrong bumper or the wrong brake assembly for that vehicle that was passing in front of them, it didn't matter. Put it on the vehicle, keep this line moving, we will fix it after release. Right? This behavior eroded the US automakers' share of the domestic market from 1962 to 1982 by 20%. They lost that market share to the Japanese. The Japanese had figured out how to manufacture products at high velocity while maintaining high quality. They did this through the learnings of W. Edwards Deming. In 1982, Deming published his book, Out of the Crisis, which I would recommend all of you read because there are still lessons decades later that we can learn from this. But he went to the automakers and said, after decades in Japan working with the manufacturers there and understanding how they build products and how they build great products that can take over global markets, it's time to pay attention to the suppliers that we're using, to work with the best suppliers and the highest quality parts, to put those into the products that you're manufacturing and delivering to market. And one of the quotes that I got when I was reading this book that really sunk in, you can't inspect quality into the product. That line worker, if they had a defective product, right? If they had a part that there was something wrong with it, it was too late for them to do anything about changing that behavior or changing that quality. That quality had to be baked in earlier into the life cycle. Quality had to be built in earlier by selecting the best parts and the best products to create the best vehicles. And it was lessons in 1982 that Deming was bringing to the auto industry. And a couple of years later, Goldrath in 1984 published The Goal to tell us how to do manufacturing better, how to remove bottlenecks, identify bottlenecks from the system, provide fast feedback loops, and so forth. And those lessons were reiterated in 2013 when Gene Kim introduced the Phoenix Project and told us all about the 3 ways of DevOps. Now, hopefully all of you have read the Phoenix Project. If not, get on Amazon right now. Forget what I'm saying, order the book and read it. But the first way of DevOps is emphasizing the performance of the entire system and never passing a known defect downstream. And if something bad happens in the second way of DevOps, we need to create fast feedback loops to tell us about that so that we can correct the system, hopefully in an automated way, to keep us moving at high velocity, but also maintaining quality. So today I'm going to challenge some of our thinking and understanding of what happens in terms of how we're developing software today. We're going to do this by introducing Sonatype's 3rd annual State of the Software Supply Chain Report. This is a report that I've championed for the last 3 years at Sonatype, and on Friday we finished it, and you all are the first to see the results of this report. Right? With software supply chains, we understand innovation is king for your organization. Right? Speed is critical to our success. And open source is at center stage of a lot of what's happening within our organizations. To best understand that, we've put together this report that details a lot of the consumption, the huge volume of consumption and the velocity of consumption of open source components and containers throughout our development and operations teams. And I'm going to share with you this brand new data. The report was just released this morning at 9 a.m., and let's take a walk through it. But for those of you that are not familiar with software supply chains, let me just walk you through it, because a supply chain, a software supply chain, works like any other supply chain in manufacturing worldwide. You have a population of open source projects, a community of open source projects that act as the suppliers within software supply chains, right? Those open source projects make their code available in central warehouses on the internet. Whether that's Maven Central, npmjs.org, rubygems.org, python.org, the NuGet Gallery, Docker Hub, they're all centralized warehouses that all of our organizations feed upon to take those components to maintain the velocity that we need. We don't want to code from scratch anymore. We want to pull from the internet in a second a new component that allows us to be more efficient and use those components to assemble finished goods or services that we make available to market. So let's start at the beginning of the software supply chain with the suppliers and what we know about them. Through analysis that we did in this year's report, we recognize that over 1,000 new, almost 1,100 new open source projects hit the market every day. Across all open source projects globally, 10,000 new versions of their products are released every day. Products, the parts that we rely on. When I analyzed 380,000 open source projects for this report, I found the average release was 14 times a year. You have a massive supply in which to build your products and services upon. Today, over 3 million JavaScript components exist out there, over 2 million Java components. We're getting close to 1 million Python and NuGet components that are out there for us to access within development. And it's not just that there's a huge supply out there, the demand is massive. Numbers I can't imagine other than they're in this report. Last year, if you're one of the 7 million people that use npmjs.org to get your NPM packages for development, right? You helped download 59 billion JavaScript packages last year. If you're a Java development shop, you've downloaded 52 billion components last year. In JavaScript alone, they went from 22 billion to 59 billion downloads from 2016 to 2016. From 2015 to 2016. The population consuming these is relatively small when you compare it to the billions that are being consumed worldwide. The growth is exponential. If you look at Docker containers, the consumption is also growing at a massive rate. Docker earlier in DockerConf in the keynotes this year said that they had just had 6 billion pulls from Docker Hub last year. This year they expect 12 billion. The consumption that we have coming into our organizations is happening on a massive scale. And this impacts the landscape of what we're building and what we're operating on. 80 to 90% of the modern application is now built from open source and third-party components. And when you look at the use of containers and the tremendous adoption of containers in the enterprise, 80 to 90% of our IT infrastructure is also being containerized, or is also being turned into components that we're sourcing from outside of our walls because we don't want to build it ourselves and put it into our environments. It makes us incredibly efficient. It keeps velocity going. But there's a secret behind all of this. And some of us kind of know this. I think all of us are aware of it. But not all these parts are created equal. So in the State of the Software Supply Chain report this year, we detail some of the realities and deliver some of the empirical evidence about what's happening in our software supply chains. So this year, I worked with our team to analyze 122,000 open source projects that had known security vulnerabilities in them. These are projects that are releasing every day, 14 times a year. They have known security defects in them, and only 15.8% of the time did the open source project ever release a new version to fix that security vulnerability. If it has a vulnerability, it's likely staying there. And when it does get fixed, the average mean time to repair is 233 days. There are some projects, there were about 400 projects that had mean time to repairs of over 2,500 days. That's like 7 to 10 years. If you're going to rely on suppliers to help you build what you need to build, those are not the type of suppliers you want to work with. But there's a population of hundreds of open source projects that have mean time to repairs of 2 days. If there's a problem with their product, they fix it, and they make that available to the community of all of us that will consume these. When we looked at the open source consumption, so when we go from the supply to the demand side, and we look at what people are consuming, this is data over the last 3 years. And it shows, this is for Java component specific data that I have a lot of access to. Being at Sonatype, we run Maven Central, so I can analyze all of this data. We see the number of defective components, or the components with security vulnerabilities, the percentage of those is going down. But across the billions of downloads that we saw last year, 5.5% of those downloads, the day they were downloaded, had a known security vulnerability in them. 1 in 18 components you're bringing into your organization has a known security defect the day that you're bringing it in. Imagine any product that you're using right now, or that you use to get here, or that you use in your home, having 1 in 18 defective parts. So no one in here has an organization that's downloading 1 billion parts. I can tell you that, right? The largest I've seen any organization is about 16 million parts a year. But the average organization, when I studied 7,500 organizations this year that were downloading components, the average organization just on Java components alone is consuming 125,000 components a year. If you're developing in Java, Ruby, Python, and .NET, you're bringing in even more than this. If you're using Docker containers and sourcing from Docker Hub, you're bringing in even more than this. Your software supply chain is very active, and every single one of your organizations has one that is in full effect and high performance. But across these downloads that I see just in the Java realm alone, 5.8% across this population, similar to the global 5.5% in downloads, had a known vulnerability associated with it when it was downloaded. When we look at, are these defects not only being downloaded, but ending up in the end user applications, there was a great report released earlier this year called Thou Shalt Not Depend on Me, released by Northeastern University. They analyzed 133,000 websites using JavaScript components. And what they found was that anywhere from close to 40% to close to 90% of some of the most popular components, from handlebars to jQuery to Angular, were using the known vulnerable versions of those components in their web applications, when perfectly safe versions were available to them. Some of the components were 7 to 10 years old, had never been updated. There are hundreds of new versions available, and yet we're relying on the old, outdated, and known defective parts. And it's not just limited to open source components. When we look at containers, I ran a survey earlier this year of 2,200 DevOps professionals. And they said 88% of us are concerned about security when deploying containers into production. That's no surprise. You should be concerned about, I don't know what the other 12% aren't concerned about, or maybe they really, have great practices in place. But there was an article published in June that showed even in the standard Docker system runtime, 261 system calls are open for attack in the standard configuration. Docker's done a lot to improve the security of its runtime over the past couple years. It used to be a lot worse, right? But they're making progress. But if you're using default images of anything, right, you need to rethink what the quality is of what you're putting out there, even in the default configurations. But there is hope, right? Over the last few years, I've documented what's happening from one end of the software supply chain to the next, to understand if what we're feasting upon is actually making it into the end products. So when we look at the global consumption at 5.5% of those downloads had known vulnerabilities, I also looked further down the supply chain. I looked at repository managers, Nexus and Artifactory, to figure out what downloads to the local warehouses that organizations are using as kind of their well or the drinking water of these components locally. What percentage of those downloads were vulnerable? Almost 7.5% were vulnerable. When we looked at hundreds of applications that people had submitted for analysis, they wanted to figure out, hey, I have open source components in my applications. Like, what components am I using? Do any have known license risk or security vulnerabilities or anything like that? They were creating a software bill of materials. They were trying to understand the impact of what their software supply chains are doing. Those organizations found 4.6% of the components in their applications had known security defects. So effectively, from one side of that supply chain to the next, the components that had vulnerabilities or defects, not including if they had license risk or if they were severely outdated, are flowing through the software supply chains. But when we also analyzed thousands of applications that were operating in managed supply chains where people had policies to operate and govern what components are we using, what's the quality of those components, how good are those components that we're using in our apps. In those more controlled environments, 1.7% of the components had a known security defect in them, which shows a dramatic improvement from managed software supply chains or trusted software supply chains to untrusted, where we saw improvements from 63 to 69%, depending on if you're measuring just the end app that we're producing ourselves, or if you're measuring from the consumption point to, did we filter any of these out along the way? It's pretty impressive to see those results. But in the state of the software supply chain, one of the things that we also do is we spotlight success stories from around the industry and case studies so that we can all learn as organizations, what are others doing out there in the industry that we might learn from and apply into our own organizations. And these case studies throughout the report show organizations improving their time to deploy by 90%, removing tens of thousands of hours from manual assessments of what they have to automating these assessments early in the development lifecycle, where they're shortening their feedback loops and baking security and other governance aspects into design. so that they understand what they're pulling in is of the highest quality. And they're improving their application quality by as much as 48% within these organizations. So this is really cool. If you manage your software supply chains, you can actually improve not only your velocity, improve your the speed of your feedback loops, improve the quality of your applications, right? But there is an opportunity for us to do something. But before we get too happy, I want to walk you back to Detroit. And this time, we're going back to Detroit, 1965. In 1965, Ralph Nader produced Unsafe at Any Speed, the design-in dangers of the American automobile. Because Ralph understood that we were manufacturing products at high velocity that had known dangers or known defective parts in these products that would harm consumers, right? That we wouldn't stand for producing or buying products that had known defects or dangers in them. And we wanted to bring safer products to market. So he started a movement that led to more regulation, that led to more governance, because the people building the products weren't caring enough about what they were delivering out to all of us as consumers. In the State of the Software Supply Chain report over the last 3 years, I've been documenting what's happened in terms of the awareness and understanding of software supply chains, especially as it relates to governments and policies and regulation and guidelines that have been introduced to the market. In the beginning, 3 years ago, we had people talking about, you should probably not use known vulnerable components when you're building software, but that was kind of it. OWASP and FS-ISAC and other organizations kind of presented these guidelines. And then last year, a few more government entities from 18F to the FTC to other organizations started building in more language into recommending what their members or constituents' rules or guidelines they should follow. In this year, in 2016 as well as in this year, the White House, the FDA, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Commerce, Homeland Security, organizations, government organizations domestically and internationally have released guidelines to say you need to build security into your development practices early to understand that we have secure coding practices. You need to produce a software bill of materials so that you understand, are you building products with known defects in them? Because if you are, you shouldn't be selling those in the market. You should correct them before you ship them. And the British government went further than I've seen any organization by words and actions when it said where most organizations are assessing their cybersecurity risk on a cost-benefit analysis, right? At the end of the day, these organizations are ultimately liable for the security of their data and their systems. If you're using known defective parts and putting them into products that you're assembling and offering to market, that's gross negligence, right? You are ultimately liable for that. If you get breached, you're liable. This was what the UK government published earlier this year, and they just fined one of their city councils £100,000 for gross negligence. You put in known defective parts and your site was breached and citizen data was stolen, and we're going to hold you responsible. There is a movement happening here similar to what Nader was starting, and we're just 3 years into tracking this in terms of the supply chain report. If you're not paying attention, you need to be paying attention. The report details, you can read all of these organizations. We footnote all of the sources. So if you work with any of these organizations, you can read the guidelines directly for yourself. So I want to challenge all of you out there to take a better understanding of your software supply chains. To understand what are we relying on that makes us so fast? And are we relying on the best quality parts from the best suppliers to help us produce the best products? Or is someone else out there doing it that's going to beat us in the market? Right? Think about the first way of DevOps. Understand the performance of the entire system end-to-end of your software supply chains and never pass a known defect downstream. If you want a copy of the software supply chain report or these slides, steal a trick from Gene Kim, right? My out-of-office message is on, right? It will send you a note automatically that has the report and the slides on SlideShare. You can download those immediately. You don't have to register to get the reports. But take the report, read the report, go to lunch with your colleagues and start a conversation. Do we know what we're bringing in to our organization? Do we care about the quality, and how does that impact our competitiveness as an organization locally, nationally, or internationally? Start to ask questions. The report is the data that provides the beginning of the conversation for all of you. So thank you very much to Capital One, DevOps Days DC, and all of you for coming here. I'm really looking forward to meeting a lot of you today. I'm super excited about the open spaces sessions this afternoon, as well as all the other speakers, and thank you very much. I'm not introducing the next speaker, so I can't help you there. Nathan.
Hey, do you have any questions? Do you have a couple of minutes for questions if you like?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah?
Let's go for it.
What questions can we answer for you? By we, I mean Derek.
Come on, didn't you read the report while I was speaking?
I totally read the report. That's why I was late.
Yes, there's a question over here.
And could you just repeat the question?
So the question or the process to use and understand the known vulnerabilities. So there are a lot of different data sources that we pull from. The National Vulnerability Database is probably the biggest one. Sonatype has its own data services team that does a tremendous amount of assessment, not only of the Java components in Maven Central, but as well as the .NET, JavaScript, Python, and other communities. So we're pulling that information together, and we can match it up with download data that we know from Maven Central that Sonatype runs, but we also this year worked with the folks at Python, the NuGet Gallery, and npmjs.org to get more information so it's not a Java-specific report as it was when we started 3 years ago. Any other questions? It's hard to see the top of the room.
I got one more right here.
Yes, sir. Yeah, you know, that's a really good question. Should we flag things on Maven Central with known vulnerabilities, or for that matter, any other public repositories, right? I often get the question on like, hey, if there's known vulnerable components, like why in the world would you allow anyone to download those things? Like, those are dangerous parts in the warehouse, and you're allowing people to access them, right? So part of it is, if we, the idea of flagging the components is, there are things that we're doing to introduce the capability for developers to understand what components they're using that might have known defects in them. To flag them in the central warehouse might not be the most efficient way of doing it, but we need to get the information to developers themselves. You can't remove defective parts from the immutable repositories, because if there's a part that ever goes bad and you need to rebuild your application, with the original parts, you need access to those. We saw with npmgate a couple of years ago what happens when you remove a component from a repository. Bad things happen, like thousands of builds break instantly. So that's not a possibility to kind of clean the warehouse, but there are technologies out there, not just from Sonatype, but others in the industry, where we can flag or make people more aware of what they're using so that you don't have to do hours of research yourself to figure out, is the part good or bad, right? But the aim is we have to know, as an organization, as a global community, are the parts good or bad that we're working with? Because if you don't, then you keep producing, you know, one out of 18 parts in your products having known defects.
All right. Thanks very much, Derek. Let's hear it for Derek Weeks.
Thank you.